Hey, what's up YouTube? This is tcgsam, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about what I think are going to be the top 10 decks for the June 2025 TCG format. Now that we're a month or so into Alliance Inside format, we have a bunch of results for this current format, so the decks that I talk about in this video will be based more on actual results, although of course there's still going to be some level of subjectivity when I talk about which decks are better than which, so do keep that in mind. I'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each of these decks and how I think they'll perform in the metagame overall, as well as highlight any interesting deck building trends that have emerged for each of these decks. I'll also talk about some decks that are honorable mentions or sleeper picks for this current format, but that'll be in a separate video coming next week, so do stay tuned for that if you're interested. But with all that being said, let's hop straight into it. Cracking into the top 10, we have Pure Mitsurugi or Mitsurugi Fiendsmith. Starting off with Pure Mitsurugi, this is a list that got second place at the Halifax Regionals, and I would say the strengths of Pure Mitsurugi are that it can play power cards like Pot of Extravagance, and it doesn't really play into that many hand traps like Fulos. But overall, its biggest weakness I think is that it has a much lower ceiling than any of the decks on this list. All of its interruption is concentrated on resolving the Murakumo effect to blow up your board on your turn, so it loses out a lot more to cards like Bystials and Salesman calling Murakumo, for example. And then for Fiendsmith Mitsurugi, this list is from the top 8 Des Moines regionals. I would say the biggest strength of this deck is that it gets access to the Fiendsmith engine and also really has a higher ceiling than the Pure, but at the same time gets hurt by more common hand traps like Fuolos, since you're now playing the Fiendsmith engine, and the Fiendsmith engine also contributes to a few more clunky hands sometimes with just too many normal summons. The two engines also don't really have great synergy with each other aside from just both being generically good splashable engines, which I think can be a problem since it feels like sometimes you're just going to be playing one deck with the other deck's bricks in it. Now overall, I think both these decks are still pretty solid, but both do have some consistency issues overall in my opinion. I overall think that Ryzeal Mitsurugi is a much better way to play Mitsurugi since it just gives the deck a lot more consistency. Coming in at number 9, this is a deck that really surprised me, and that's Evil Twin Fiendsmith. This list got second place at the Des Moines Regionals, and overall, Evil Twin Fiendsmith feels like the best home for, I guess, the quote-unquote Fiendsmith pile or pure Fiendsmith variants, since it's very easy to bridge from like the live twin engine into your Fiendsmith engine, since they do have a light fiend built into their normal combo. I also feel like the live twin engine is just more competent as like a standalone deck versus something like Kashira or Bystials that the old pure Fiendsmith decks were playing. Like if your Fiendsmith engine someone gets cut off or you're not able to access it, the Evil Twin engine is something that can hold its own nowadays compared to something like just good cards like Cash or Bystial. The Evil Twin engine also generates a ton of advantage through getting draws off of like their little level 2 extender as well as their Link 1 effect, and I feel like that's one of the biggest strengths of the deck. It just gives the Evil Twin Fiendsmith player just more chances to draw into non-engine, which is really nice. My biggest problem with this deck is that it sometimes feels a bit predictable in the sense that there's only really one way to go through your combo. Like the combo sort of forces you to make the Link 1 and then either go Fiendsmith combo there, or if you're just doing live Evil Twin stuff, you have to make like the Link 2, bring back the little guy, make the other Link 2, bring back the Link 2, and then link into the Link 4. And its combo lines are generally just not as flexible as something compared to Maliss, which has a lot more options. So overall, I think it may be a little easier to stop. It also gets hurt a lot by Fulos, which is in everyone's deck, and this deck is not a deck that has a way to put up a decent board without giving your opponent a ton of draws. So overall, even though it was a pretty surprising result, it did get a few top 8s here and there. I don't think it'll go much higher for the weaknesses that I mentioned, but this is definitely something that should now be on everyone's radar. Making a splash at number 8 is Atlantean Mermails. This list got top 8 at the Netherlands Nationals, and overall I think Mermail is still a very scary deck when it gets to go first. It can set up a protected water barrier statue with cards like the Neptibus Link 3, and it also still has hand rip potential with Moulin Glacia, Trishula, and Deep Sea Minstrel can still look at your hand to rip out any power hand traps like Droll. Going second, its engine is also probably one of the best in the game right now at just breaking boards. Like you have cards like Storming Atlantean, you have cards like Heavy Infantry, you generate so much advantage just through playing. You can break half boards with just your engine alone, which is something that's really good this current format. Of course, this deck does have some weaknesses to key hand traps like Droll and Charmies, which are being played in everyone's deck, and sometimes it feels like your hands are a little bit clunky if you don't, because the deck just plays a couple more engine requirements in order to do its combo, and it also feels like the deck does kind of have a bottleneck in trying to get to Neptibus. If the Mermail player isn't able to access Neptibus or the Neptibus doesn't resolve, the deck doesn't exactly fall apart, but it's a lot harder to generate advantage to keep playing from there. So I feel like a good player when playing against Mermail will just know to be able to try to cut off the Neptibus axis, and that can be a problem for the Mermail deck. Despite all that, this deck still has quite a few high finishes, and even though it has more tops than some of the other decks above it, it doesn't have a win yet, so that's why I'm not putting it any higher than number 8. Overall though, it is still a very strong combo deck that I just think is slightly outclassed by the rest of the decks above it, but despite that, I think it'll still continue to do well just because there's no Abyss Dweller stopping them anymore. Coming in at number 7 is White Forest Azamina. This list got first place at the Toronto Regionals, and I also want to note that this player also consistently does well with this deck, and the reason I'm bringing that up is because while this deck I think is a very strong combo deck, it seems pretty hard to pilot well at a top level and requires a ton of experience to be able to navigate all the different lines. I also think its biggest downside is that it just has way too many engine requirements. I feel like there's so many awkward cards that you don't want to draw, like you just want to send throughout your combo to be able to access different parts of your deck, but you never actually want to see them in your hand. Even if the deck goes over 40 to accommodate for that, it just doesn't really have enough room for non-engine, which can be pretty scary because going second, this deck's just going to struggle a little bit if it isn't able to see that. Although, credit where it's due, this deck does at least seem very competent at playing through normal hand traps and puts up a very strong end board. And also, side note that there isn't that much targeted hate for this deck right now, but if this deck becomes more popular in the future, I think a card like Dark Ruler No More could be played more, and it could really hurt this deck since I think that's one of the few cards that can be fairly effective at almost shutting out this deck entirely. Overall though, I think this is a solid placement for the deck. I think it'll continue to float around the top 10 as more people try it out and figure it out, but I just think that the next deck on this list has sort of the same strengths as this deck, but just does it a little bit better. That deck at number 6 is going to be Memento Fiendsmith. Now, there is a slight fall off from the prior format, but I think that Memento is still a deck that's going to be pretty good this current format. This list got first place at the New Haven Regionals piloted by Pac, and even though Memento didn't do as well in terms of results as I thought in my last video, it still seems a few tops here and there. It's overall a very solid combo deck still with a ton of extenders, and can also play through popular hand traps like Fua and Droll fairly easily as well. And that's something that's super important because the main cards that people are using to stop their opponents are hand traps like Fua and Droll. Now, the only downside I can really think of for this deck is that it takes a ton of skill to pilot well and be able to play around all those different hand traps just because of how many different combo lines there are. So, at least from what I've seen, it seems like only the most skilled players are really seeing results with this deck because it's pretty hard to play well for so many rounds at a big tournament. I know that's something that may be overlooked a lot, but fatigue really catches up to you when you're playing a long tournament, and if you're not super experienced with the deck, then it can really take a toll and make you play a lot worse. Not to mention, this deck also has, I guess, a few more engine requirements than some of the other top decks, so it could lead to more clunky hands and just overall less non-engine space though. Overall though, even though it isn't able to play the most non-engine, its engine is still really good at just playing into boards, so I think that it's still a very scary deck. But I think the reason it isn't seeing more play is because maybe people just feel Maliss is just slightly more powerful overall, and or just more importantly, easier to win with. Like, overall, Memento is a very good deck, but like I said before, it just takes a great pilot to get the most of it, and I think that's why you aren't seeing as many results for this deck. So I'm curious to see where this deck will go in the future. Maybe players will start switching to this deck because it is also a really powerful combo deck like Maliss that can play through a bunch of hand traps. There doesn't really seem to be that silver bullet against it like a card like Lancia is to Maliss. Next up at number 5, hot off a top 8 placement at YCS Providence, we have Crystron. This list got first place at the LA Regionals, and the reason I'm showing this list over the YCS Providence top 8 list is because it still shows that you can play Kashtira in the deck in addition to like the Horus option that got popularized after it got top 8. There are also a lot of viable versions of Crystron in my opinion. Like, you could play the Horus version that got top 8. You could play like Cash in it like people were doing before Crystron got top 8 at Providence. Or you can even put them both together, as you can see in this list from the LA Regionals. Like, it just goes to show I think this deck is very flexible and you're able to play a lot of good generic supporting engines in it. And I think the Speedway cards are still really good if you're on a more budget build of the deck. Overall, Crystron is a very solid mid-range deck that's able to play through hand traps pretty well, and it's also one of the few decks in the top 10 right now that actually has Omni Negates like Cyber Dragon Infinity and Dawn Dragstar on their end board, in addition to great follow-up as well. Most other decks just have good interruptions, so decks like Ryzeal have like a bunch of pops, and like decks like Maliss have a bunch of banishes, but no decks aside from this really have like hard Omni Negates, and that can be important in a format where people might start switching to certain board breakers in the future if the format does develop that way. It just makes it so Crystron has some very powerful, potent endboard pieces just because they are actually hard negations. Now, the main issue I have with Crystron is that it its engine just doesn't have that many great pushes. Like, there are only so many extenders in the deck, and its engine itself generally isn't going to be good enough at playing through a lot of boards, even half boards. Not to mention, it also gets caught in the crossfire with a card like Lancia that's going to be in everyone's side deck, because that also hurts this deck as well. Now, all that being said, though, overall, I think Crystron is a very good deck in the format, and one that I could expect to continue to be around, like, middle of the pack for the top 10. Coming in at number 4, we have pretty much all the non-Mitsurugi Ryzeal variants, so versions like Pure Ryzeal, Fiendsmith Ryzeal, and Heraldic Ryzeal. Ryzeal is, of course, still very strong. Detonator is one of the best consistent end war pieces that we have in the game right now. I'll start off by talking about the Pure version. This list got top 32 at YCS Providence, and I think the main advantage of the Pure Ryzeal deck is that it has the space for the most non-engine. It can also play the extra Ryzeal spell and traps like Cross and Plasma Hole, meaning your Star Ryzeal gets a lot of extra value as well. The downside with the Pure version, I think, is that it needs to play arguably more suboptimal cards like Small World or 7th Ascension to maintain the same level of consistency that these other Ryzeal variants have. And its ceiling is also pretty capped at pretty much just like Detonator, Cross, and maybe like the Trap card, since they don't have access to like a supplementary engine like all these other Ryzeal variants do. You can argue that like maybe the Nemesis cards can sort of be considered like a supplementary engine, but Nemesis can also feel kind of weird in the deck because the engines don't really have any inherent synergy with each other compared to something like Mitsurugi, which does. The next list I want to go over got second place at YCS Providence, and that's going to be Fiendsmith Ryzeal. This was the best deck of the last format, but after the hits, I don't really think it's nearly as good as it was before. I guess the main advantage of this deck is that it gets to pivot fairly nicely between the engines, since Ice Ryzeal doesn't lock you into rank 4s when you normal summon it, and Lacrima is a level 4, so that means cards like X Ryzeal are still going to be live even when you get access to your Fiendsmith engine. Overall, the Fiendsmith cards give you a much higher ceiling and also better grind game from the engine itself, but I guess the disadvantage is that sometimes they can feel a bit clunky and also suffer from some consistency issues, since you can't play cards like 7 Tachyon without compromising the Fiendsmith engine in this deck. And then finally, we have the Heraldic Ryzeal deck. This is a list that got second place at Swiss Nationals. I guess the main advantage of Heraldic Ryzeal is that you essentially get to FTK your opponent if they don't see enough hand traps using Evil Storm or Ouroboros and just hand looping them a bunch of times. The Heraldic cards are very good at facilitating that, but I guess the downside is that you have to play so many bricks in the Heraldic engine that I wonder if it's even worth it, because a lot of the times the normal Mitsurugi Ryzeal board, if you're able to go off uninterrupted, is generally enough to beat every other deck in the format. This is something that I guess could be worth experimenting with though, because the Heraldic cards are still very good and provide rank 4 access, so I don't think this deck is bad by any means. I just wonder if it's worth pivoting to this version of the deck when Mitsurugi Ryzeal is just able to win on its own. Coming in next at number 3, we have a deck that caught me by surprise, but has actually gotten the 3rd most event tops in this past month. It's going to be Primite Blue-Eyes. This is a list that got first place at the Indianapolis Regionals. It is a Fiendsmith build, but the standard build is pretty much just the same thing, minus the Fiendsmith cards, and playing closer to 40 with a little bit more non-engine. I think that the biggest strength of this deck is that the Primate engine offers great disruption through a card like Drill Beam, which is one of the best endboard interruptions in the game right now. And also, the Blue-Eyes engine has really solid grinding game with a card like True Light. Another underlooked strength, I think, is that this deck is a lot simpler to play. So as you get more fatigue throughout a tournament and you play more and more rounds, you're less likely to make mistakes than you are with other decks like Maliss. I think this is something that's super underlooked, because if you haven't played like an 8-round, 9-round day 1 of YCS or something like that, I think it's hard to understand like how exhausted you are at the end of the day, and you want to make sure that you're playing at your best. And if your deck is pretty easy to and straightforward to pilot, you're much less likely to make mistakes and throw the game. Now, the downside of this deck though is that it sometimes feels like it folds to regular hand traps like Droll and Ash Blossom, since it doesn't really have the most number of extenders. And not to mention, I guess there are a few awkward cards you don't want to draw like Mausoleum and Blue-Eyes, but I don't really have anything bad to say about this deck in addition to that. So overall, I think it's probably going to be a top 5 deck for this upcoming format, since it's very solid overall, has quite a few strengths, but I don't think it'll ever be able to surpass the number 1 and 2 slots. In the penultimate spot, we have Maliss. I heard this list is from a very smart, handsome, and talented individual. Okay, fine. It's just my list that I got the top 4 at the Toronto Regionals with. If you haven't checked out the in-depth deck profile and Maliss deck building discussion video, be sure to do so. I'll link it in the description. I go over the list more in depth there, explain some of my card choices, and also talk about commonly debated card choices in Maliss, like whether you should play TB11 and whether you should main GWC or not. The most notable thing about Maliss lists nowadays is that everyone is on Topologic Bomber Dragon, so I think that a card like Chaos Hunter just becomes a lot worse than it has in previous formats. Every Maliss player is going to have an engine out to it now, so I think people are going to start pivoting away from playing Chaos Hunter. Now, even though I don't think Maliss is the #1 deck, it obviously is still very strong, with it being in pretty much every single top cut for these premier events in multiples. It's a deck that can push through a ton of hand traps and still end on very strong boards, plus it has one of the most broken extenders in the game right now in a card like Backup at Ignister. Speaking from experience though, the downside with this deck is that sometimes you just draw hands that like lose with a single hand trap. Like you'll draw hands that have like too many normal summons or something like that. And Lancia is still very impactful against this deck if you don't have access to Backup at Ignister. So overall, I think because of these few weaknesses, Maliss is going to remain at a solid second place. Like obviously it's still going to continue to top just because of how powerful the engine is going first and how much non-engine they can play for going second, like upwards of like 19 to 20. But with silver bullets like Lancia in every one side deck and the occasional lack of consistency and awkward hands sometimes you run into, it probably won't be able to take first place unless somehow there's a big meta shift. Now coming in at #1 is, no surprises, Mitsurugi Ryzeal. The list you see here got first place at the Netherlands Nationals, but to be honest, when I was looking for lists, like I could have taken a list from pretty much any of the tournaments that happened this past month. It seems like this deck took up nearly half the top cut in most of these tournaments, and I think it just goes to show how popular and strong this variant of the Ryzeal deck is. This deck does a lot of things really well. Like it has all the strengths of the Ryzeal and Mitsurugi engines, and the nice thing about it is that both engines are accessible from each other. Like your Mitsurugis are level 4s, and if you're just resolving the regular Mitsurugi combo, you'll eventually get to a duo drive, which gets you access to the Ryzeal side of your deck. And of course, if you start with just the Ryzeal side of your deck, you can go into King Love Feral Imps to get into the Mitsurugi side of your deck. And also, aside from Droll and Lockbird, there just aren't really any super hard counters to this deck either, and just because of how much gas that it has. Like, it feels like you kind of have to see Droll to really have a chance to stop them. Otherwise, they should be able to play through a lot of low-impact hand traps unless they brick. I guess the only bad thing I can say about this deck is that now that it's pretty definitively #1, people are definitely going to start preparing for it more, understand how to counter it or like where to stop it, and maybe start siding more cards in their side deck as well. Like even though there aren't big blowout cards, they may start siding more cards that are targeted towards hitting Mitsurugi Ryzeal. So overall, there isn't really too much to say about this deck. I'm pretty confident that it's going to remain the best deck until we get the next set, just because of how consistent it is and how high of a ceiling that it has with both engines. So that's going to do it for this video. Let me know what you thought about in the comment section below. What decks do you think we'll see more of as the format continues? And do you think any of the decks I discussed today are actually fraudulent and shouldn't be here? I'm curious to hear what you think. Also, once again, stay tuned for next week's video as I go over 3 underrated decks that I think could be a decent pick going into this upcoming format. So if you don't see your favorite deck on here, it could be in that video. I also want to give a quick shout out before I end off the video to CardTrader and Your Playmat. You can check them out using my affiliate links in the description below and use code TCGSAM to get 5% off your entire order at CardTrader, or code SAM10YP to get 10% off your order at Your Playmat. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.